Right, today I'm going to talk about silence and its importance. The most effective way of doing that is just spending the next 10 minutes in silence. You find out for yourself by direct experience. The trouble is that if we do that, of course, the mind will become very noisy, probably. It is worth thinking or contemplating about silence first. What it means. A good place to start is why we are in silence in retreats. When we go on retreat, we are in silence, as they say. And the use of silence as inner communication, if you like, or inner discovery, is not limited to Buddhist practice. In one shape or form, it belongs to almost all religious or mystical practices, including the Christian one. And it's interesting why that should be the case. Why should we go into silence, and what is the significance of silence? In retreat, we talk to each other when we arrive, then we eat in silence, and we continue in silence until there's a Dharma talk, and then we are back in silence, which means that, or what does it mean? Does it mean if we bump into somebody in the corridor, we don't speak to them? No, not necessarily. You could nod. This could be quite a misunderstanding about what we mean by silence, and I think that's cleared up if we distinguish between inner silence and outer silence, or between inner noise and outer noise. So it is quite possible that one could be quite a noisy environment externally, and yet have mastered the art of inner silence, which would mean that your thought processes and so on are at a very low level. Your awareness is quite high, you're quite alert. However, one is not anxious, one is not thinking, one is not worrying, one is not planning, one is not regretting, or maybe all of this at a very low level. And then if one's awareness is high, you notice when the mind starts chattering again. Outwardly, you may look very peaceful and quiet, but it's quite possible that you're quite agitated inside. So the art is to develop inner silence, because that's where the real peace is. We used to have sessions in West Molesey, which happens to be over a flight path from Heathrow, part of the year, some years back, and we would be in the middle of meditating when a jumbo jet would come over, and it felt as though it was just about 20 feet above the building. You know, it was earth-shattering, really. We keep changing the flight paths, of course, to share the noise with everybody, rather than inflict it on just one group of people. But people will say, oh, you know, this is terrible. How can we can't meditate here? And I say, well, actually, it's quite a good test whether you can maintain inner silence. Now, the moment you start thinking, what an awful noise that is, could they change the flight path, let's make a complaint, etc., you're generating a lot of inner noise, funnily enough. But of course, this is not to say there's no connection between inner noise and outer noise, or inner silence and outer silence. Of course, there is a connection, but it's a good practice to not take outer noise as a distraction or something that is something negative, but just kind of park it at a distance. So you kind of know it's there, but it's not a point of focus anymore. Now, one easy way to do that, which is a natural way, is that one gets wrapped up in one's own thoughts and therefore drops the outer noise. That's not what we're trying to do, actually. We're trying to drop the inner noise as well. Okay? Now, you probably all notice that if you're focusing on something, maybe in a book or in your own thoughts, especially if you have a deep worry or concern, that outer noise seems to die away, or it could be absent. Probably we've all had this phenomenon where somebody's shaken you and say, "Are you listening?" But you're not listening, and you're actually not heard, even though somebody is saying something to you, or there's a lot of noise going on. So the mind has the capacity to switch off outer noise. It can do that. Can it do it at will? Is one way of approaching it. I think we need a prop, an inner prop, in order to let go of the outer noise. So the obvious one is paying attention to one's breathing. And first of all, it does feel like there's a little bit of a battle between the attempt to stay with the breathing motion in one's awareness and the outer noise. After a while, if you insist, as it were, make a mental effort, you will find that if you give yourself enough time, you will be able to let go of the outer noise, or it'll come in now and then. But the important thing is attitude. Is if you see it as troublesome, then it will be troublesome. You know what I mean? So instead of trying to expel it, it's just like, well, it's there, but it's of no interest. It's the best way I could put it. It's there, but it's of no interest. So what is of interest for the time being is focusing on my breathing. Now you can go on from that, where you can actually let go of the breathing as well. That requires quite a bit of practice. So, outer noise, inner noise. There can be a lot of inner noise even though there's no outer noise. So you might think, well, this is a wonderful place to meditate. It's very silent, very quiet. Meanwhile, there's turmoil going on within. I think we've all experienced that. So it's important to remember that we're not looking so much for outer silence as inner silence. But of course it does help. That is why we go on retreat. That's why we would go to a monastery or retreat centre, or go for a walk in the countryside, simply to make things a bit easier for ourselves. But even then, what we're interested in is bringing about some inner silence, or if not absolute silence, let's say inner quietude or solitude. And that has a wonderful, delicious feel about it. And it's also empowering because it's creating space in which you can contemplate other matters about your life or your apparent difficulties or whatever. So silence is very important. It could be silent within and noisy without. It could be noisy within, silent without. It depends on how you manage to culture your ability to meditate. And silence has other significance. A lot of positive things can turn up. I mean, some negative things can turn up, of course, but a lot of positive things can turn up quite unexpectedly if you're deep in inner silence. Things that don't get a chance to be heard when your mind is in turmoil. Because you know how it is when you're worrying or upset about something. The mind becomes obsessed. It's right into this worry or concern. That means there's no opportunity for anything very positive to turn up. Even outwardly, you would miss things that might have some beauty in them, in the garden, to look out through the window. But also some positive thoughts about people, certain persons, about certain actions, about episodes in your life, about things that you would like to realize in your life. They don't have a chance if there's a lot of inner noise. Create the inner space and things will happen inwardly that might surprise you. Sometimes, even for people like scientists, the greatest ideas, the greatest mathematical solutions have popped up quite unexpectedly when they were having a silent moment. But even from a ethical or spiritual point of view, things can turn up if you allow them a chance to grow amongst all the racket that tends to arise. Another thing about silence is that we don't always appreciate silence in dialogue or conversation. We in the West, in particular, this is a great generalization, but we live in a society in which, and I feel this myself, because we all do, is that I feel a pull, that somehow there's something pulling us towards keeping the conversation going, even if it's becoming quite trivial or silly, or even worse, if it's turning into gossip, which is not a good idea. In other cultures, people are much more comfortable with silence than we are. When I was in Japan, I think I've told you this before, there wasn't such a demand on chattering on, as there is in our society. So, like if you're alone with somebody you don't know very well in the car going somewhere, we feel we must talk about something, even if it's the weather. Let's talk about it. Whereas I would be sitting next to a Japanese colleague who spoke good English. That wasn't the problem. And we could go 10, 15 minutes without saying anything. But it wasn't like he was trying to think, what should I say? I was all thinking, this is becoming uncomfortable. I should say something, even if it is only about the weather. It's an interesting thing to see that silence has its own dynamic, that it is a contribution sometimes. It's creating that space in which things can arise of their own accord. Sometimes important things that are always suppressed by chatter. It gives respect to the other person to allow them to speak. Some of us are much more talkative than others. I tend to be a talkative person, obviously. My dear grandmother must have been one of the most talkative people on the planet. You just couldn't stop her. She didn't actually mind all that much if you weren't listening either, which was quite interesting. She was a lovable old dear, always offering me more and more cups of tea until tea was practically pouring out of my ears. So yeah, some of us are quiet by nature and some of us are talkative by nature. I think it's good to be aware of that. In terms of meditation, when is it good to think or talk? Or when you're learning, when you're sharing ideas, all of that is positive, okay. But the equal weight should be given to, right, it's time to stop talking now. It's time to create some inner space or let things arise. I have an almost mystical conviction that things arise when there's silence. My favorite metaphor for this is trying to grow some tomatoes in the garden some years back. And they looked like they were growing well. Tomatoes were actually appearing. And then I noticed some brown marks at the bottom on the stems. And I already knew what that was. It's something called brown stem, which is a fungal infection, I think. But it's a gardener's horror because once that starts, there's no way you can stop it. You know that it's just finished. It's just done for. And you just watch this brown stem creeping up the stem into the fruit, and that's the end of everything, really. So, pull it all out, burn it, and hope that it won't happen again, which is very difficult actually because it's almost certainly in the soil. But anyway, so I pulled them all out. Now this was to me a sort of representation of chatter and noise and aimlessness, disappointment and all the rest of it. But the following year, I decided that I wouldn't bother with tomatoes. And guess what? A tomato popped up in a completely unexpected place. The most beautiful tomato I've ever had. And I just didn't touch it. I didn't do anything. I didn't really fertilize it there. I didn't expect it to be there, but there it was. And I just thought, that is amazing, really, because it was really a very nice tomato plant. But you see, all my efforts, all my noise making, hadn't produced a tomato. And yet, when I just shut up, didn't do anything, up pops this wonderful tomato. This is absolutely true, and enjoyed having the tomato in a salad later on. But it's just a little metaphor of how in life we need to leave spaces, and there's great value in silence. I'll just stop there.